All right, so let's take an example on what we mean by isolating a component. Right. So we'll start with a component that we've already seen in a previous class, right? And we'll see how it's going to be refactored from a stateful implementation to a stateless implementation, right? So let's see. So a while back we worked on one of the more boring features of our assignment, working with quotes, right? I left you the more interesting ones, and I took on the quotes here, where we had a quotes component which rendered a list of quotes. Yes? Right? And this was implemented as a React stateful component, right, where it was just a plain old class, an extended component. It had a constructor, and here's where it maintained its state. Right? It declared a local variable bound to the current instance called state, and inside we had several other variables in there, a lot of state variables in there, such as quotes. I think it had another quote object as well in there. And then this state was used by the rendering down below to iterate over these quotes and represent them either as tables or as lists or whatnot. Yes. So this is what makes this component stateful. Right? It's maintaining this current state. It also had the dependency of a remote data service, right, where we would unload. We would fetch all the list of quotes so that we can then update the state and then render all the quotes. It also kept in here the implementation of several event handlers, right, that were bound to all sorts of click events and on-change events that were spread out over the rendering of the components, right, and all those events were invoked these functions. These functions in turn made access to the remote data service, right, and then updated the local state based on that data that came back from the server. Yes, right. So it's implementation of what most implementations you might already have in your components. Right. Again, this is stateful. It maintains its own state. It manages its state as the events transition the component from one state to the next state, and it has dependencies with remote data services. And down below, typically you would have a rendering portion, right, where it displays the title, and then perhaps iterated over the quotes, displaying each quote in a row, or a form that allowed you to manipulate a particular instance. Yes? Right, so it's pretty much what we have already in each one of your implementations. What we want to do is to instead transition to something like this, right? Where what we really have here is only mostly just the rendering part. Just the rendering part. Right? But we are no longer responsible for maintaining any of our state. Instead, that state is being fed to us as an argument. Somebody's telling you, hey, here's your state, right? Render it. That's all you have to do. You don't have any other responsibility. I'm giving you the state. The only thing you have to do is just iterate over it and render it. Also, the transition of event handling, that would transition the state. Also, we're going to delegate that. Right? It is no longer going to be our responsibility. Instead, someone is going to pass us functions or references to functions, right? That from inside here, we're going to bind them to clicks and on clicks and on change and on whatever, right? And instead of implementing coding, binding them to local functions which we don't have, instead we're going to bind them to these functions that have been passed into us. See that, right? And so when we invoke a button, or when we click on a button, we click on the delete of a particular item, we're going to call this delete quote that has been passed to us. See that? Right? What this allows us to do, right, having this implementation allows us to create unit tests and instantiate this quote and pass whatever we want for the states of the quote. See that? Right? No longer is this component responsible for knowing where that state came from. We know what it is, what the unit test is, and we can pass it along for rendering, right? Also, it would allow us to inject, right, or instantiate this quote and provide our own implementation of these functions, right? So that we can test to see that if you click on a particular button, if indeed the actual function is being invoked. Okay. If instead it lived inside of the implementation of this stateful, there would be no visibility, right, to these functions from outside of this class. You see that? Instead, we're passing it all through the API so that we can inject whatever implementation we want. Now, in the actual implementation, these functions actually do what they're supposed to do, right? Go out to the server and actually delete something or update something. They do what they're supposed to do. But on the test, in the test, we can inject our own implementation, right, and verify that the event handling does work. Make sense? Right? So that's going to be the new implementation for the right. And the only real concern for this component will be just rendering. All the focus, all the effort will be just focusing on rendering. Make sense? Again, this allows us to break up into different concerns. And this is a very common technique, right, of identifying what are the concerns, and then making very clear where one thing ends and what other things happen. For instance, another design pattern that's very, very common is the model view controller. Again, that's a design pattern that addresses the different concerns of modeling, right, of the view and the control, right? Data modeling, on how the data is structured. If you have many-to-many, one-to-many, and you have primary keys and foreign keys, whatnot, all that is a huge concern. How to deal with that? Yes, right? But the rendering, how this is going to be displayed, is a completely different set of concerns. Yes, and so usually to be able to deal with the complexity of large applications, we apply the principle of separation of concerns. So this is what we've done here is that we have separated the concerns of state management. How is it handled? How is the state of this handled? I don't know. It's not my concern. Right? Somebody's just passing it to me, right? And same thing. If they click on this button, what should happen when this button is clicked? I don't know. It's not my concern. I only notify someone, and somebody does some magic, and somehow we get a new quote or we remove a new quote. It is not our concern. Make sense? My concern is only to render them and make them look pretty. Right? That's my only concern. Now, obviously somebody is going to be responsible for this. We're going to delegate that concern to someone else. Right? We're going to move all the state management, all the event handlers, right? We're going to move it to some other component, and we're going to call it the container component, right? And the container component, its only responsibility will be state management. It will have no idea how this is rendered, has no idea where the data comes from, right? Its only responsibility is to keep track of what this current state is and handle any events that come in and calculate what the new state should be. Basically, it's a state machine. Right? It's the implementation of a state machine. If you're in this state and this event occurs, then you generate this other state. Yes? Now, a better solution might be Redux. If you're comfortable or you're familiar with the technology, I would certainly invite you to use Redux instead. If you're not, this is plenty. All right, we're going to keep this implementation. All right, we're going to keep it simple. The other thing here to note here is that again, I'm stressing here that the only responsibility of the container is to maintain state. Okay, and then pass the state to whatever element actually renders that state. Right? I don't render it. I pass that state. I pass the state to someone who knows how to render it. So, here are the quotes. You render it. I don't know how to render it. Here they are. I only manage that state. Okay. But the other thing to point out here is that notice that the service here, we have a reference to that service, but that service is being passed to us, right? We're not managing the life cycle of this service. Somebody is passing the service to us. Somebody's injecting that service from outside, right? And it's not my responsibility to keep track of that service. What this allows us to do when we're doing unit tests is that it will allow us to unit test this state management component by injecting the service and providing our own mocked implementation of that service, right? So that we can validate that the state management, that our state machine is working, right? That it calculates the new state correctly whenever you have these particular events when you start at a particular state. Okay. All right. So here too, we would have the not only do we keep track of the state, right, which we then pass down to the rendering. We also keep track of any event handlers, right, that used to live inside of the rendering. We've ripped them out, and now they live up here, right? And we just pass a reference to them down to the rendering components, right, so that the rendering component, right, doesn't need to implement it. They just notify, and the notification trickles or bubbles up to the implementation here in the container. Again, we've separated the concerns of state management, rendering, and data access layers. Okay.